History remembers Cleopatra as the woman who seduced two of Rome's most powerful men. But what if that story was written by her enemies? What if the last queen of Egypt wasn't remembered for her beauty, but for her brilliance, her political genius, and her desperate fight to save an empire that had stood for thousands of years? This is the true story of Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of ancient Egypt, and the woman whose death marked the end of one of history's greatest civilizations. The princess born into chaos the Mediterranean world was burning. Great kingdoms had already fallen, powerful dynasties were collapsing, and the Roman Republic was slowly transforming into an empire that would dominate the ancient world. Yet along the fertile banks of the Nile, one ancient civilization still survived. Egypt had stood for thousands of years, surviving invasions, rebellions, and the rise and fall of countless rulers. But by the 1st century BCE, the kingdom was no longer ruled by native Egyptian pharaohs. It was ruled by a Greek dynasty descended from one of the greatest conquerors in history, Alexander the Great. When Alexander conquered Egypt in 332 BCE, he was welcomed as a liberator. After his death, his empire was divided among his generals, and Egypt fell to Ptolemy, one of Alexander's closest companions. His descendants would rule Egypt for nearly 3 centuries, creating the Ptolemaic dynasty. They built magnificent palaces in Alexandria, controlled immense wealth from the Nile, and presented themselves as pharaohs to the Egyptian people while remaining culturally Greek. Over time, however, the dynasty became notorious for political intrigue, family rivalries, and violent power struggles. Brothers fought sisters, queens betrayed kings, and the royal palace became a dangerous place where loyalty could change overnight. Into this world in 69 BCE, a princess named Cleopatra was born. Her full name was Cleopatra VII Philopator. Unlike the glamorous legend that would later be created by Roman writers, the real Cleopatra was first and foremost a political heir born into a deeply unstable kingdom. Her father, Ptolemy XII, was a weak ruler who depended heavily on Rome for support. Egyptian nobles despised his dependence on foreign powers, and many people viewed him as an ineffective king. During Cleopatra's childhood, she watched her father struggle to keep his throne, while Roman politicians increasingly interfered in Egyptian affairs. But Cleopatra was not an ordinary princess. Ancient sources describe her as highly intelligent, exceptionally educated, and remarkably charismatic. She studied philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, rhetoric, and politics. Most importantly, she learned languages. While many earlier Ptolemaic rulers spoke only Greek, Cleopatra reportedly learned Egyptian in addition to several other languages of the Eastern Mediterranean. This ability allowed her to communicate directly with diplomats, merchants, and subjects without relying entirely on translators. It was a rare skill for a ruler of her dynasty and would become one of her greatest political advantages. As she grew older, Cleopatra began to understand a dangerous truth. Egypt's greatest threat was no longer another kingdom, it was Rome. The Roman Republic had become the dominant military power of the Mediterranean. Roman generals controlled vast armies, and Roman politicians decided the fate of kingdoms far beyond Italy. Egypt remained wealthy, but wealth alone could not protect it forever. Cleopatra watched as Roman influence grew stronger each year, and she learned that survival would require more than royal blood. It would require intelligence, strategy, and the ability to navigate the brutal world of Roman politics. When Ptolemy XII died in 51 BCE, Cleopatra was only 18 years old. According to Egyptian tradition, she was expected to rule jointly with her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, whom she also married as part of the royal custom designed to preserve the dynasty. Officially, they were co-rulers. In reality, a fierce power struggle began almost immediately. Cleopatra was ambitious, confident, and determined to rule independently. The advisors surrounding the young Ptolemy XIII feared her influence and worked to push her aside. Tensions inside the royal palace escalated rapidly. Decrees were issued in the boy king's name, while Cleopatra attempted to maintain her own authority. Before long, the conflict turned into open political warfare. By 49 BCE, Cleopatra had been forced out of Alexandria. Exiled from the capital, she fled eastward and began gathering supporters and troops. For many rulers, exile would have meant the end of their story. But Cleopatra refused to surrender. While her enemies celebrated their victory in Alexandria, she prepared to fight for her throne. And then, fate intervened. Across the Mediterranean, another civil war was raging. Julius Caesar, Rome's most powerful general, was pursuing his rival Pompey. After a series of dramatic events, Pompey fled to Egypt seeking refuge. Instead of protecting him, the advisors of Ptolemy XIII ordered him killed, hoping to win Caesar's favor. When Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria and discovered that Pompey had been murdered, he was furious. The Roman general now found himself drawn into Egypt's internal conflict. Cleopatra immediately recognized the opportunity before her. If she could gain Caesar's support, she might reclaim her throne and secure Egypt's future. Ancient writers later told a famous story. Cleopatra had herself secretly smuggled into Caesar's quarters wrapped inside a carpet or a bundle of bedding. Historians debate the exact details, and the story may have been embellished over time, but the essential point is clear. Cleopatra managed to meet Caesar privately despite the danger surrounding the palace. That meeting would change the course of history. A young exiled queen, facing the loss of her kingdom, had just placed her fate in the hands of the most powerful man in Rome. And before long, Egypt would be plunged into war. By 48 BC, Cleopatra had lost everything. She was no longer sitting on Egypt's throne. Forced into exile by her younger brother and his advisors, she watched from the eastern frontier as her kingdom slipped from her grasp. Most rulers would have accepted defeat or gathered a desperate army for one final battle. Cleopatra chose something far more dangerous. She would gamble her future on the most powerful man in the Roman world. Julius Caesar. At that moment, Rome itself was in chaos. Julius Caesar had crossed the Rubicon, defeated Pompey in a brutal civil war, and pursued his rival across the Mediterranean. Pompey fled to Egypt, hoping the young king Ptolemy XIII would protect him. Instead, the king's advisors believed they could win Caesar's favor by murdering Pompey before he even reached shore. They presented Caesar with Pompey's severed head as a gift, but instead of gratitude, Caesar was horrified. However ruthless he could be in war, Pompey had once been his political ally and the husband of his daughter. Rather than celebrating the assassination, Caesar condemned it and decided to remain in Alexandria to settle the growing conflict inside Egypt. For Cleopatra, this unexpected turn of events created one final opportunity. She knew Caesar was not simply another Roman general. He was a brilliant strategist whose support could restore her to power, but reaching him would be nearly impossible. Her enemies controlled Alexandria, guarded the palace, and watched every entrance. Walking through the city openly would almost certainly mean capture or death. Ancient writers, especially Plutarch, tell the famous story that Cleopatra secretly entered the royal palace wrapped inside a rug or concealed in a large linen bedding sack carried by her loyal servant, Apollodorus. Modern historians debate the exact details, and the dramatic image may have been embellished over time. Even so, most agree on the essential fact. Cleopatra secretly met Caesar by bypassing her enemies and appearing before him unexpectedly. Imagine the scene. Inside the royal palace, Caesar was discussing Egypt's political crisis with his officers when servants delivered what appeared to be ordinary luggage. Moments later, the wrapping was loosened, and before the most powerful man in Rome stood a young queen who had risked everything. She was only about 21 years old, but she spoke confidently, intelligently, and without fear. She did not beg for mercy. She presented herself as Egypt's rightful ruler and argued that restoring her to the throne would bring stability to a kingdom that Rome desperately needed. Contrary to the legends repeated for centuries, ancient sources place far greater emphasis on Cleopatra's intelligence than on her physical beauty. Plutarch himself wrote that her charm came from her conversation, wit, education, and personality rather than extraordinary appearance. She spoke several languages, understood politics better than many experienced rulers, and knew exactly how to persuade powerful people without appearing weak. Caesar quickly recognized that Cleopatra was not merely seeking his protection. She was offering him a reliable political partner. Supporting Cleopatra also served Caesar's interests. Egypt was one of the richest kingdoms in the Mediterranean, supplying enormous quantities of grain that helped feed Rome's growing population. A stable Egypt under a loyal ruler would strengthen Caesar's position while preventing further unrest along Rome's eastern frontier. What began as a meeting between a Roman general and an exiled queen soon became a political alliance that would reshape the ancient world. But Cleopatra's return to power would not happen peacefully. King Ptolemy XIII and his advisors refused to accept Caesar's decision. Tension inside Alexandria escalated into open conflict. The city became a battlefield as Roman soldiers loyal to Caesar fought against Egyptian forces supporting the young king. The struggle, remembered as the Alexandrian War, spread through streets, palaces, and the city's famous harbor. During the fighting, ancient sources report that fires broke out along parts of the waterfront. Some later writers suggested these fires may have damaged portions of the Great Library of Alexandria, though historians continue to debate the extent of that destruction. For months, Caesar and Cleopatra found themselves surrounded by enemies inside Alexandria. Reinforcements eventually arrived from Rome's allies, tipping the balance. In the decisive battles that followed, Ptolemy XIII attempted to flee but drowned in the Nile River after his forces collapsed. With her rival gone, Cleopatra finally reclaimed the throne. Following Egyptian tradition, she formally ruled alongside another younger brother, Ptolemy XIV. In reality, however, Cleopatra became the dominant ruler. For the first time since her exile, she controlled Egypt once again. But her greatest political victory was still unfolding. Her alliance with Julius Caesar had transformed her from a displaced queen into one of the most influential rulers in the Mediterranean. Soon afterward, Cleopatra gave birth to a son named Ptolemy XV Philopator Philometor Caesar, better known as Caesarion, meaning Little Caesar. Cleopatra maintained that Julius Caesar was the child's father. Although Caesar never publicly declared Caesarion his legal heir under Roman law, the boy became central to Cleopatra's vision for Egypt's future. Through him, she hoped to unite the prestige of the Ptolemaic dynasty with the power of Rome itself. The future seemed brighter than ever. Cleopatra had regained her kingdom, secured the support of the most powerful man alive, and welcomed an heir who could strengthen her dynasty. Yet beyond Egypt's borders, powerful Roman senators watched Caesar's growing influence with increasing fear. They believed he was becoming too powerful, perhaps even a king in all but name. Within a few years, those fears would erupt into one of history's most famous assassinations. Caesar's death would once again plunge Rome into chaos and force Cleopatra into the most dangerous political game of her life. Cliffhanger. The man who had restored Cleopatra's throne was about to be murdered, and the queen who had outsmarted every rival in Egypt would soon face an even greater challenge, the battle for the future of Rome itself. On the 15th of March 44 BC, the most powerful man in the Roman Republic fell beneath the blades of his closest friends. Julius Caesar was assassinated inside the Senate House, stabbed 23 times by a group of conspirators who claimed they were saving Rome from tyranny. In a single afternoon, Cleopatra lost her greatest ally, and Egypt once again stood alone. When news of Caesar's assassination reached Alexandria, Cleopatra understood the danger immediately. Caesar had protected her throne, but now the Roman world was descending into another civil war. Surrounded by ambitious generals, rival politicians, and shifting alliances, she could no longer rely on Rome's stability. Before returning to Egypt, she quietly left the city with her young son, Caesarion. Ancient writers disagree on exactly how long she remained in Rome after Caesar's death, but they agree that her departure marked the beginning of a new and uncertain chapter. Back in Egypt, Cleopatra focused on strengthening her rule. Around this time, her younger brother and co-ruler, Ptolemy XIV, disappeared from the historical record. Ancient sources suggest he may have died suddenly, and some later writers accused Cleopatra of arranging his death. However, there is no definitive evidence proving this claim. What is certain is that after his death, Cleopatra named her young son Caesarion as her co-ruler, securing the future of her dynasty. Meanwhile, Rome was tearing itself apart. Caesar's adopted heir, Octavian, the brilliant general Mark Antony, and Marcus Lepidus formed the Second Triumvirate, an alliance created to defeat Caesar's assassins. Together they crushed the conspirators at the Battle of Philippi in 42 BC. With their enemies defeated, the Roman world was divided among the three leaders. Mark Antony took control of Rome's eastern territories, placing him in direct contact with Egypt. The meeting between Antony and Cleopatra would become one of history's most famous encounters. In 41 BC, Antony summoned Cleopatra to the city of Tarsus in modern-day Turkey. Officially, he wanted answers about Egypt's role during Rome's recent conflicts. Cleopatra, however, recognized another opportunity. She had once impressed Julius Caesar with intelligence and diplomacy. Now she intended to do the same with Antony. Ancient historian Plutarch describes Cleopatra's arrival in unforgettable detail. Her royal barge sailed along the river, with purple sails billowing in the wind and silver oars flashing beneath the sunlight. Fragrant incense drifted through the air while musicians played across the deck. Whether every detail is literally true or partly embellished by later writers remains uncertain, but there is little doubt that Cleopatra deliberately staged her arrival as a display of wealth, confidence, and royal authority. When Antony finally met Cleopatra, he encountered far more than a queen. She was an experienced ruler, fluent in diplomacy, economics, and military strategy. Unlike many foreign monarchs Rome dealt with, Cleopatra understood Roman politics almost as well as the Romans themselves. Their conversations extended far beyond personal attraction. Together they discussed trade, military alliances, finances, and the future balance of power across the Eastern Mediterranean. Their relationship soon developed into both a political alliance and a personal partnership. Antony spent the winter in Alexandria, where ancient writers describe lavish banquets, intellectual discussions, and elaborate court ceremonies. While Roman propaganda later portrayed these months as evidence that Antony had abandoned his responsibilities, modern historians believe much of that image was exaggerated by his political enemies. In reality, Antony remained deeply involved in military planning while Egypt provided enormous financial and logistical support for his campaigns. Over the following years, Cleopatra and Antony had 3 children together: Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus. These children symbolized not only their family, but also their shared ambition to create a powerful Eastern empire capable of rivaling Rome itself. As Antony prepared for campaigns against Parthia, one of Rome's greatest rivals, Egypt became indispensable. Cleopatra supplied money, grain, ships, and resources that Antony desperately needed. In return, Antony restored several eastern territories to Cleopatra's control, expanding Egypt's influence across parts of Cyprus, Phoenicia, and other regions. In 34 BC, Antony held a remarkable ceremony in Alexandria known as the Donations of Alexandria. Before thousands of spectators, he publicly distributed territories among Cleopatra and their children. Caesarion was proclaimed the legitimate son of Julius Caesar, while Cleopatra was honored with the title Queen of Kings. To supporters in Egypt, the ceremony celebrated a new era of prosperity and stability. But in Rome, it was viewed very differently. Octavian immediately recognized an opportunity. He launched one of history's most successful propaganda campaigns, portraying Antony as a Roman hero corrupted by a foreign queen. Roman poets, politicians, and public speakers accused Cleopatra of using wealth, luxury, and seduction to manipulate Antony into betraying his homeland. These accusations spread quickly throughout Rome, shaping Cleopatra's reputation for centuries. Modern historians urge caution when reading these accounts. Nearly every surviving Roman source was written after Octavian's victory and reflects the political climate of his rule. Cleopatra had become Rome's enemy, and portraying her as a dangerous temptress helped justify the coming war. While her intelligence, diplomatic skill, and political ambition are supported by multiple sources, many sensational stories about her personal life likely owe more to propaganda than to historical fact. By 32 BC, diplomacy had collapsed completely. Octavian declared war, not officially against Antony, but against Cleopatra herself. It was a carefully calculated political decision. Framing the conflict as a war against a foreign queen allowed Octavian to present himself as the defender of Rome, rather than as another Roman leader fighting a civil war. Across the Mediterranean, armies gathered, fleets prepared for battle, and 2 visions of the future stood on a collision course. On one side was Octavian, determined to unite Rome under his leadership. On the other stood Antony and Cleopatra, fighting not only for their own survival, but for the independence of Egypt itself. Everything would be decided at sea. Cliffhanger. The greatest naval battle of the ancient world was about to begin. Within a single day, Cleopatra would lose far more than a war. She would lose an empire that had survived for thousands of years. On the morning of September 2nd, 31 BC, hundreds of warships gathered near the western coast of Greece. The calm waters of the Ionian Sea concealed a battle that would determine the future of the Mediterranean. On one side stood Octavian, the ambitious heir of Julius Caesar. On the other were Mark Antony and Cleopatra, fighting to preserve both their alliance and the independence of ancient Egypt. Before the sun set that day, one of the world's oldest civilizations would begin its final chapter. For months, Antony and Cleopatra had assembled a massive fleet at Actium. Antony commanded experienced Roman legions, while Cleopatra contributed ships, wealth, and the resources of Egypt. Yet despite their strength, problems were already growing inside their camp. Disease spread through the crowded military camps, food supplies became scarce, and many of Antony's allies began losing confidence. Octavian's commander, Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, had already captured key ports and cut off vital supply routes, slowly weakening Antony's position before the battle had even begun. When the fighting finally started, Octavian's fleet held a critical advantage. His ships were smaller, faster, and easier to maneuver. Antony's vessels were much larger and heavily armed, but struggled to respond quickly in the narrow waters. Ancient historians describe hours of fierce combat as arrows darkened the sky, soldiers clashed across decks, and burning ships drifted through clouds of smoke. Then came the moment that has puzzled historians for more than 2,000 years. In the middle of the battle, Cleopatra's squadron suddenly sailed away from the fighting and headed south toward Egypt. Antony abandoned the battlefield and followed her, leaving much of his fleet behind. Ancient Roman writers accused Cleopatra of cowardice, claiming she had fled to save herself. But many modern historians question that interpretation. Some argue the withdrawal may have been a planned attempt to preserve Egypt's treasury and surviving fleet, after realizing the battle was already lost. Others believe Antony and Cleopatra intended to regroup in Egypt and continue the war from there. The truth remains uncertain because nearly all surviving accounts were written by Roman authors after Octavian's victory. Whatever the reason, the result was catastrophic. Without their commanders, Antony's remaining forces collapsed. Thousands surrendered. Others were destroyed. Octavian had won the Battle of Actium not simply through military strength, but through superior strategy, logistics, and leadership. From that moment onward, Egypt's fate was almost impossible to reverse. Back in Alexandria, Antony and Cleopatra prepared for the inevitable. They strengthened the city's defenses, gathered what remained of their armies, and hoped to negotiate with Octavian. Cleopatra even explored possible diplomatic solutions, but Octavian had little interest in compromise. He understood that as long as Cleopatra lived, she could remain a powerful symbol around which resistance might unite. In the summer of 30 BC, Octavian's armies marched into Egypt. As Roman forces closed in on Alexandria, Antony received false reports that Cleopatra had already taken her own life. Overcome by grief and believing everything was lost, he fell upon his own sword. The wound was not immediately fatal. According to Plutarch, Antony was carried to the mausoleum where Cleopatra had taken refuge. There, in one of history's most famous scenes, he died in her arms. With Antony gone, Cleopatra faced an impossible decision. Octavian wanted to capture her alive. His plan was to display the defeated Queen of Egypt during his triumphal procession in Rome, a public spectacle that would celebrate Rome's victory before thousands of cheering citizens. For Cleopatra, who had spent her life defending the dignity of her dynasty, such humiliation was unbearable. On August 10 or 12, 30 BC, the exact date remains uncertain. Cleopatra died inside her palace in Alexandria at approximately 39 years of age. But how she died remains one of history's greatest mysteries. The most famous story claims Cleopatra allowed herself to be bitten by an Egyptian cobra known as the asp. Ancient writers associated the cobra with Egyptian royalty, making the tale both dramatic and symbolic. Yet many modern historians question whether this account is physically plausible. Cobras are unpredictable, and transporting one unnoticed into a guarded palace would have been difficult. Another possibility is that Cleopatra used a carefully prepared mixture of poisons. Ancient sources mention toxic substances, though none provide definitive proof. Because no contemporary forensic evidence survives, historians cannot determine the exact cause of her death with certainty. What remains clear is that Cleopatra chose death over becoming Octavian's prisoner. Shortly afterward, Caesarion, the son Cleopatra claimed was Julius Caesar's child, was captured and executed on Octavian's orders. Ancient tradition preserves a chilling phrase attributed to one of Octavian's advisors. "Too many Caesars is not a good thing." Whether those exact words were spoken is uncertain, but the decision itself effectively ended the Ptolemaic dynasty. After nearly 3 centuries of Greek rule in Egypt and more than 3,000 years of pharaonic civilization, the kingdom ceased to exist as an independent state. Egypt became a province of the Roman Empire, providing grain, wealth, and strategic power to Rome for centuries to come. Yet Cleopatra's story did not end with her death. For generations, Roman authors portrayed her as a dangerous seductress whose beauty had corrupted powerful men. This image served Octavian, now Emperor Augustus, by justifying his victory and presenting Rome as the defender of civilization against a foreign queen. Over time, literature, paintings, theater, and later films repeated many of these stories until they became part of popular culture. Modern historians, however, paint a more complex picture. Rather than seeing Cleopatra primarily as a romantic figure, they describe a highly educated monarch fluent in several languages, skilled in diplomacy, economics, naval strategy, and statecraft. She inherited a kingdom already threatened by Roman expansion and spent more than 20 years using every political and military tool available to preserve Egypt's independence. While she ultimately failed to stop Rome, Her determination delayed Egypt's absorption into the empire and left one of history's most enduring legacies. Archaeologists continue searching for new evidence about her life and death. The exact location of Cleopatra's tomb remains unknown, though excavations at sites such as Taposiris Magna continue to explore possible clues. Each new discovery brings historians closer to understanding the woman behind the legend. More than 2,000 years after her death, Cleopatra remains one of the most recognizable figures in world history, not because she conquered vast territories, but because she stood against the greatest empire of her age and refused to surrender her identity, her kingdom, or her dignity. Ending history often remembers the victors. It was Octavian who became Augustus, the first Roman emperor, while Cleopatra's story was written largely by those who defeated her. But when we look beyond propaganda and legend, another image begins to emerge, not simply the tale of a beautiful queen, but of a brilliant ruler, a determined strategist, and the last pharaoh of ancient Egypt. Empires rise, empires fall. But some names refuse to disappear. Cleopatra's is one of them.